He was born into a family that moved constantly across the small towns of the American Midwest, never settling long enough to build anything permanent, never far enough from financial hardship to feel secure. His father was an accountant who struggled to keep the family stable across a series of relocations that defined his childhood as a sequence of new schools, new neighborhoods, and new beginnings that never quite took hold. He grew up in Des Moines, Iowa, in circumstances modest enough that luxury was entirely theoretical, something that existed in movies and magazines, but had no connection to the daily reality of his life. He had no design training, no fashion industry connections, and no obvious pathway into the world he was determined to enter. He taught himself to sew as a teenager, started making hats in his bedroom, and arrived in Chicago with nothing but the work he had made with his own hands. Within a decade, he was dressing Jacqueline Kennedy for the most watched moment in American public life. Within 2 decades, Halston was the most celebrated American fashion designer of his era, the first designer to build a genuine lifestyle brand in this country, and the man who defined the aesthetic of an entire American decade. This is the story of how a poor boy from Iowa became the most famous name in American fashion. If you are new to this channel, welcome. If this kind of story is what brings you back, hit the like button right now, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Now let us get into it. Roy Halston Frowick was born on April 23, 1932, in Des Moines, Iowa, in the second of 4 children born to James Edward Frowick and Hallie Mae Holmes. His father worked as an accountant, a profession that provided a measure of middle-class respectability, but not the kind of financial stability that could absorb unexpected disruption without consequence. The family moved repeatedly during Halston's childhood, relocating across Iowa and Indiana as his father's work required, which meant that Halston grew up in a state of constant displacement. Always the new kid in a new school in a new town, building friendships and routines that would be interrupted before they could fully form. That experience of perpetual starting over shaped him in ways that would be visible throughout his career, giving him both a restlessness that drove him forward and a self-reliance that came from never being able to depend on the continuity of his circumstances. The family eventually settled in Evansville, Indiana, where Halston spent his adolescent years and where the particular quality of his imagination began to express itself in a form that the people around him found unusual. He was drawn to fashion with an intensity that had no obvious source in his environment, no family background in the industry, no local culture that celebrated aesthetic ambition, and no institutional encouragement of the kind that might have given a more conventionally directed young person a structured path toward their interests. What he had instead was his own hands and the determination to teach himself what he needed to know. He began making hats as a teenager, constructing them from materials he gathered and assembled himself, developing through repetition and observation a technical skill and a design sensibility that were entirely self-generated and entirely serious from the beginning. The hats he made were not the amateur productions of a hobbyist discovering a pastime. They were the work of someone who was already thinking about proportion, balance, and the relationship between a constructed object and the person wearing it with a sophistication that went well beyond what self-teaching alone could typically produce. He had an instinct for the visual logic of clothing and accessories that no amount of instruction could have implanted, and that expressed itself clearly in the work from its earliest stages. His mother, Hallie, recognized that instinct and supported it with a warmth and a practical encouragement that gave him permission to take his own abilities seriously at a time when most of the signals from his environment suggested he should be directing his attention toward more conventional ambitions. Her belief in him was a specific and meaningful contribution to what he eventually built. Not simply the generic encouragement of a supportive parent, but the informed recognition of someone who could see the quality in what her son was making. If you are enjoying this story so far, now is a great time to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share this video. There are more stories like this one coming, and you do not want to miss them. Halston left Indiana for Chicago in the early 1950s with the intention of entering the fashion industry in whatever capacity would take him, and with the portfolio of hats and the self-taught technical skills he had developed through his teenage years as his primary professional asset. Chicago was not New York, and it was not Paris, but it was a real city with a real fashion industry presence, enough of a commercial infrastructure to give a young man with genuine ability a place to begin. He enrolled briefly at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, one of the most respected art and design programs in the country, which gave him his first exposure to formal design education and to the professional vocabulary and technical frameworks that his entirely self-directed training had not provided. He also began working during this period at a millinery shop, applying and developing the hat-making skills he had been building since his teenage years in a professional context for the first time. The transition from making hats in his bedroom to making them for paying customers in a commercial setting required adjustments that went beyond the purely technical, demanding, and understanding of client relationships, professional standards, and the commercial logic of the fashion trade that his self-directed education had not addressed. He made those adjustments quickly and completely, demonstrating from the beginning of his professional life the combination of creative confidence and practical adaptability that would characterize his approach to every challenge his career subsequently presented. His work in Chicago brought him to the attention of the city's fashion community with a speed that reflected both the quality of what he was making and the precision of his instinct for the kind of hat that a particular moment in fashion required. The 1950s were a decade when millinery still occupied a significant place in the wardrobe of the fashionable American woman, when a well-chosen hat was understood as an essential element of a complete and considered appearance rather than an optional accessory, and Halston's ability to design hats that were both technically accomplished and genuinely fashion-forward placed him at the productive intersection of craft and commerce that a young designer needed to occupy in order to build a professional reputation quickly. And he built that reputation in Chicago with a focus and an efficiency that suggested someone who had been preparing for exactly this moment for a long time and who was not inclined to waste it now that it had arrived. By the late 1950s, Halston had established himself sufficiently in Chicago's fashion world to attract the kind of professional opportunities that pointed towards something larger than the city could ultimately contain. His work had reached the attention of people who moved between Chicago and New York, who understood where the center of American fashion was located, and who recognized in Halston's work the quality and the ambition that New York rewarded. The move from Chicago to New York was the next logical step in a career that had been building toward it since the day he left Indiana, and when the opportunity presented itself, Halston took it with the same directness and self-assurance that had characterized every significant decision he had made since his teenage years in Evansville. Halston arrived in New York City in 1958 and joined Bergdorf Goodman, the most prestigious specialty retailer in America, as a millinery designer. The position at Bergdorf's placed him immediately at the highest level of American luxury retail, in a store whose clientele represented the concentrated wealth and social sophistication of the New York establishment at its most concentrated and most demanding. Designing hats for Bergdorf Goodman customers was not an abstract exercise in fashion creativity. It was a direct and immediate test of whether a young designer from Iowa with a self-taught background could consistently produce work that met the standard expected by the most discerning consumers in the country. Halston met that standard from the beginning and then exceeded it, establishing himself within Bergdorf's as someone with an unusual combination of technical precision and creative originality that the store's customers responded to with immediate enthusiasm. His reputation grew steadily through the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, as his work for Bergdorf's earned him recognition among the New York fashion press and the social elite whose patronage defined a designer's standing in that era. He developed a client list that included some of the most prominent women in New York society, these women whose choices about what to wear carried cultural weight and whose endorsement of a designer's work represented a form of professional validation that money alone could not purchase. He was building, through the quality and the consistency of his work, exactly the kind of reputation that the American fashion establishment recognized and rewarded, and he was doing it at a pace and with a thoroughness that suggested someone who understood precisely what he was building toward. The moment that transformed Halston from a respected and successful millinery designer into a national figure came on January 20th, 1961, when Jacqueline Kennedy wore a pillbox hat of his design to her husband's presidential inauguration. The image of Jacqueline Kennedy on that day, in the pale beige wool coat and the simple, in a precise pillbox hat that Halston had made for her, was transmitted to every newspaper, every magazine, and every television screen in America and across the world. It was one of the most widely reproduced images of its era, and the hat was as central to that image as any other element of the First Lady's appearance. Within days, every woman in America who wanted to dress like Jacqueline Kennedy, which was an enormous number of women, wanted a pillbox hat, and the name attached to the hat she had chosen was Halston. The commercial and cultural impact of that single moment was disproportionate to anything that could have been planned or predicted, but it was not accidental in the deeper sense that the word implies. Halston had been given the opportunity to make that hat because his work at Bergdorf's had established him as someone worthy of the assignment, and the hat itself was as good as it was because he had spent a decade developing the skills and the design intelligence to make something that perfectly suited the woman who wore it and the moment she wore it in. The inauguration hat was the intersection of preparation and opportunity, and the preparation had been entirely and deliberately his own. The national recognition that followed the inauguration hat gave Halston a professional platform that most designers spend entire careers trying to build and never reach. He was no longer simply a hat designer at a prestigious department store. He was the person who had made the most famous hat in America, whose name had appeared in newspapers and magazines alongside the name of the First Lady, and whose work had been validated by association with the most watched public moment of the era. That platform was an asset of extraordinary value, but it was an asset that required a decision about what to do with it. Halston could have remained at Bergdorf's, deepening his millinery practice and building on the inauguration hat's fame within the established framework of his existing career. Instead, he made a different choice, one that reflected both the scope of his ambition and his recognition that the inauguration hat had opened a door that he had always intended to walk through. Through the early and mid-1960s, Halston began extending his design work beyond millinery into clothing, developing the skills and the relationships that would allow him to make the transition from hat designer to full fashion designer with the same credibility and authority he had established in his original category. He studied the construction of garments with the same focused intensity he had applied to millinery, developing a technical understanding of clothing that was grounded in the same principles of precise construction and clear visual logic that had defined his approach to hats from the beginning. He also continued building his client relationships at Bergdorf's, maintaining and deepening the connections with the women whose endorsement and loyalty would be essential to the success of any fashion label he eventually launched. In 1966, Halston left Bergdorf Goodman and opened his own business, owns a boutique on East 68th Street in Manhattan that sold both his millinery and his early clothing designs under his own name. The decision to open under his own name rather than under a house name or a label identity reflected his understanding that the Halston name was already a professional asset of genuine commercial value, the result of a decade of work at Bergdorf's and the sustained fame of the inauguration hat. He was not starting from scratch. He was converting an established reputation into a business structure that would allow him to develop that reputation on his own terms, rather than within the institutional framework of someone else's retail operation. The East 68th Street boutique attracted the kind of clientele that Halston's reputation warranted: wealthy or socially prominent New York women who had followed his work at Bergdorf's and who were prepared to bring their custom to whatever enterprise he chose to operate. It also attracted the attention of the fashion press, which covered the opening of the boutique with the kind of interest that a designer of Halston's standing commanded, and which helped extend the reach of his new venture beyond the immediate network of existing clients into the broader audience of fashion-conscious women who read Vogue and Harper's Bazaar and who shaped their purchasing decisions partly in response to what those publications covered and endorsed. Showing what distinguished Halston's design philosophy from the dominant conventions of American fashion in the late 1960s and into the 1970s was a commitment to simplicity and sensuality that was as radical in its own context as Anne Klein's sportswear coordinates had been in hers. The American fashion world of the late 1960s was in the midst of significant turbulence, pulled simultaneously toward the geometric minimalism of the modernist movement, the psychedelic excess of counterculture fashion, and the ongoing influence of European couture traditions that had defined the industry's upper tier for generations. Into that turbulent landscape, Halston introduced a design philosophy built on the opposite of turbulence, on stillness, on the reduction of a garment to its most essential and most beautiful form. He worked primarily in luxurious, as fluid fabrics, cashmere, ultra suede, silk jersey, and chiffon, materials that moved with the body rather than imposing structure upon it, that communicated sensuality and ease rather than the formality and rigidity of the tailored tradition. His cuts were architectural in their precision, but entirely opposed to architecture in their effect, because where architecture imposes form on its occupants, Halston's garments revealed and celebrated the form of the woman wearing them. He believed that a great dress should look like nothing on a hanger, and like everything on a body, that the design intelligence of a garment should be invisible in the abstract and completely apparent in the wearing. So it's the ultra suede shirt dress that he introduced in 1972 became one of the most commercially successful and culturally significant garments in American fashion history, a single design that captured the Halston philosophy so completely that it served as both a flagship product and a manifesto. The dress was made from ultra suede, a synthetic material that he was among the first American designers to work with at a luxury level, which had the feel and the drape of suede without the weight or the care requirements, making it simultaneously luxurious and practical in exactly the way that Anne Klein had argued American women's clothing should be. The shirt dress silhouette was simple to the point of austerity. Oh, but the simplicity was the result of extraordinary design. Intelligence applied to the problem of how to make a garment that worked on every body, in every context, with a quality of effortless elegance that more complex construction could rarely achieve. Halston also pioneered the concept of the American designer as a complete lifestyle presence in a way that anticipated by a decade the brand extensions that Ralph Lauren and Donna Karan would later build their empires around. He understood that the woman who wanted to wear Halston wanted to inhabit a specific aesthetic world, and that world extended beyond her wardrobe into her home, her accessories, her fragrance, and the overall sensibility of her life. He launched fragrances, designed interiors, created products for the home, and built a brand identity that was coherent across every category it touched, communicating a consistent point of view about beauty, simplicity, and the kind of luxury that expressed itself through quality and restraint rather than through ostentation and excess. By the early 1970s, Halston had moved his operation from the East 68th Street boutique to a townhouse at 68 West 54th Street in Midtown Manhattan that served as both his design studio and his primary point of contact with the clients, press, and professional relationships that sustained and expanded his business. The townhouse was itself an expression of the Halston aesthetic, designed and furnished with the same commitment to luxurious simplicity that characterized his clothing, serving as a physical embodiment of the lifestyle the brand represented and as a setting that reinforced for every visitor the specific quality of the world Halston was selling. He understood that environment was inseparable from brand identity, that the places where his work was experienced contributed to how that work was understood and valued, and he controlled those environments with the same precision he applied to the work itself. The commercial growth of Halston's business through the early and mid 1970s was driven by a combination of critical recognition, celebrity clientele, and the kind of consistent design excellence that built consumer loyalty across seasons rather than generating excitement around individual pieces. His clothes were not trend-driven in the way that much of the fashion industry organized itself. They were built on a design philosophy stable enough to produce work that was recognizably and consistently Halston, regardless of the season or the collection, giving the brand an identity that accumulated value over time rather than requiring constant reinvention to maintain relevance. That stability was a competitive advantage in a market where many designers exhausted their audiences with the relentless novelty that the fashion calendar demanded, and it was a direct expression of Halston's belief that genuine elegance was by definition enduring rather than seasonal. His fragrance, Halston, launched in 1975, became one of the best-selling fragrances in the United States and demonstrated the commercial potential of the lifestyle brand concept he had been developing throughout his career. The fragrance extended the Halston name into the daily lives of millions of women who could not afford his clothing, but who could afford to wear his scent, building brand awareness and desire at a mass scale that the clothing line's luxury positioning could not have reached on its own. The commercial success of the fragrance validated the lifestyle brand strategy and provided the financial resources to continue expanding the business into new categories and new markets with the same design coherence that had characterized everything Halston had built from the beginning. By the mid-1970s, Halston was being described regularly in the fashion press as the most important American designer of his generation, a recognition that reflected not only the quality of his work, but the breadth of his cultural influence and the commercial scale of what he had built. He had taken the name of a boy from Des Moines, Iowa, a name that had meant nothing outside his immediate family when he was growing up, and had made it into one of the most recognized and most respected names in American fashion, synonymous with a specific and beautiful way of living that millions of women aspired to, and that no other designer in America had defined with comparable clarity or sustained with comparable consistency. The Halston story is a story about the power of a singular and uncompromising aesthetic vision pursued with absolute consistency across an entire career. Many designers have genuine talent. Many designers have original ideas. And far fewer have the discipline to build an entire professional identity around a single, clear design philosophy and to apply that philosophy with enough consistency and enough intelligence that it accumulates into something larger than the sum of its individual expressions. Halston had that discipline, and he had it from the beginning, from the hats he made in his bedroom in Evansville to the ultra-suede dresses he produced in his Midtown Manhattan studio for the most prominent women in America. What he understood about fashion that many of his contemporaries did not was that simplicity is not the absence of effort, but the product of extraordinary effort applied to the problem of reduction. The genius of a Halston garment was that it appeared to have required nothing, and that it seemed to have arrived in its final form through a process of natural inevitability rather than through the kind of deliberate and technically demanding design work that actually produced it. That appearance of effortlessness was itself the result of effort, of knowing exactly what to remove and having the confidence to remove it, of understanding where the essential quality of a garment resided and building precisely toward that quality without the distractions of decoration, complexity, or the seasonal novelty that the fashion industry mistook for creativity. He also proved something about the American Midwest that the fashion industry of his era was not inclined to take seriously, which is that the place a designer comes from does not determine the quality of the vision they bring to their work. And the assumption that serious fashion required European origins or at minimum a metropolitan American upbringing was an institutional prejudice of the industry rather than a fact about the relationship between geography and creativity, and Halston disproved it as completely as anyone in the history of American fashion. He arrived in New York from Iowa with self-taught skills, homemade hats, and a design sensibility that he had developed in complete isolation from the professional environment he was entering, and he built from those materials one of the most influential careers in the history of the industry. The boy from Des Moines who taught himself to sew in his bedroom, who carried his hats to Chicago and then to New York, who dressed the First Lady of the United States and then built a lifestyle empire on the foundation of that moment, so proved that the distance between where you start and where you end up is not fixed by the circumstances of your beginning. He proved it not once with a single dramatic achievement, but consistently over decades of work that maintained its quality and its clarity from the first hat he made in Indiana to the last collection he produced at the peak of his powers. That consistency was his greatest achievement, more impressive in many ways than any individual piece he made, because it represented the sustained application of a genuinely original vision across an entire lifetime of professional work. That is the story of Halston, and if you made it to the end of this video, thank you for watching. If this story gave you something to think about or something to take with you, drop a comment below and tell us what landed. Like this video, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear a story like this one.